In this video, I will show you how to build a custom length coat rack. This one is just under 8 feet long, but you can make it any length you want and divide it into segments so you don't get your family's stuff all mixed up. This video is really geared towards people with little to no woodworking experience. This is not that hard to build, so if you're looking at this and thinking, that's so easy, why would you even need a video for it, then you are not really the target audience for this video. Again, if you don't even own the tools or know what materials to buy, then I'll kind of go through that in a little more detail than maybe you'd find in a video geared towards people with more experience. Alright, so first, here is the problem I'm trying to solve. We live in upstate New York, so cold climate, have 2 kids, so there are just a ton of winter coats and sweatshirts and things that accumulate here, and it gets messy because we have these, if you can see here, wall mount coat racks that you can buy at any box store, Target, hardware store, Amazon, whatever, that each have 5 hooks, and they are a fixed length with pre-drilled screw holes on either side. And first, those screw holes, oddly enough, don't line up well with the stud spacing in my house. So one of these is in a drywall anchor, which again, for the uninitiated, is kind of a big plastic thing that you can screw into drywall and then put a real metal screw into it. But that doesn't hold anywhere near as much weight as actually screwing into the wooden stud that's behind the wall. So for each of these, I space them such that one screw goes into an actual stud and then the other one just has to be in a drywall anchor. And then the next is that the spacing of these things, I bought 2 full-size ones and then this little half-size one. I just have wasted space on the wall, right? There's this blank space in between them because if I wanted at least one screw and a real stud for each one, I didn't have room to do 3 full-size ones end to end. So you can see on the whole wall here, there's just a lot of wasted space that could be more hooks. Since I only have 2 full-size ones, ideally all my kids' stuff gets crammed onto this one, all my wife's stuff is on this one, and then I have another spot around the corner for myself. But the kids' stuff bleeds over, so the goal is just to build, as you saw at the beginning of the video, one big thing here where there is a section for each kid, a section for my wife, smaller section over on the left for guests and everything, and then I'll have more around the corner for my my stuff and bags. Alright, let's start out by talking materials. I built this out of pine. It is a softwood. It is cheaper than hardwoods like oak or maple because pine trees grow year-round, so they grow faster. And if you go to a hardware store, you're going to want to look for the select or premium or clear pine. It may be called something different depending on where you go. But basically, that's the slightly nicer wood that doesn't have a lot of knots in it, as opposed to, go over here and look at, say, the side rails that I built for this cart on my tractor. I have a different video about that. The quality isn't as good, and there's going to be a lot more big knots like that. And maybe if you want that look, that's okay. But if you don't, the premium, select, or clear, or whatever pine is generally going to be higher quality. So I bought a 1x4 and a 1x6 because I wanted these large triple hooks, so that way when I put the 1x4 on top as a shelf, there's kind of enough room to still hang something on the top of this triple hook here. If you only want single or double hooks, then you could get away with a smaller piece for the bottom. Depends on the hook size you want. If you are new to buying lumber, welcome to the fun world where the listed size does not match the actual size of the lumber. So a 1x6 is actually 5.5 inches by 3/4. Similarly, a 1x4 is actually 3.5 by 3/4. So if you need to, take a ruler with you to the hardware store and measure the actual sizes of the lumber. But again, the listed size on the sticker, same thing for 2x4s, are actually 1.5 by 3.5 or something. Not going to bother with the whole history behind that. But again, that extra ½ inch doesn't matter too much. But in terms of if you have, for whatever reason, specific spacing you want on the wall, make sure you are thinking about the actual dimensions of the lumber and not the nominal dimensions. Now, a note about hardware. When I looked at Lowe's, these triple hooks were $4.50 each, and since I am building this giant coat rack with I think around 25 hooks, I didn't want to spend nearly $100 just on hooks. So I looked on Amazon and found them much cheaper in bulk, only around, I don't know, $1.50 or $2 each or something. But you get what you pay for. As I found out, my 5-year-old went to yank his coat off the coat rack and it just broke this one. So I guess I would rather have this cheap hook break than have him actually rip it out of the coat rack and damage the wood. But that is something to consider maybe if you have small children and you go with the cheap hooks, or if you're hanging heavy sports bags or laptop bags on them or something. Maybe these really cheap ones aren't going to hold as much weight, but again, I didn't want to spend $100 on hooks, so now I've just warned my kids to be careful and not hang on the hooks. And then in terms of screws, you are just going to need multi-purpose or wood screws. You don't need exterior or deck screws or anything, stainless steel, anything that would need to be waterproof for use outside. I had a bunch of 2.5-inch screws laying around, and they worked out pretty well for this, as you'll see when we're screwing the top shelf into the back piece. 2.5 inches is maybe a little longer than you need. 2-inch or maybe even 1.5, 1 3/4 would be okay. So once you have all the supplies, first order of business is cutting the two pieces, the top shelf and the backboard, to the length that you want. If you were going to put end caps on, which I showed at the beginning of the video, then you're going to want to cut these 1.5 inches shorter than your total length, because you're going to have that extra 3/4 inch end cap on each side. So you could do this just with a handsaw if you have it, because these are pretty small pieces of wood. If you have access to a miter saw, which again, I have one over here. I have a different video about this saw. This saw is huge. It is overkill for cutting tiny pieces of lumber like this, so you don't need a giant miter saw or chop saw to do this. I'm not going to show you how to use the saw in this video. That's kind of a topic for a different one. Point being, measure the total length you want for the coat rack. If you want the nice looking little end cap pieces, subtract off 1.5 inches and then cut these two pieces to that length. These are scraps I have left over from building the big one that I showed you at the beginning of the video, so I'm going to use these as a demonstration for how you would build a smaller one, but really the process is kind of independent of the total length. Alright, these two pieces are cut to the same length, and now bar clamps are your friend. I have a bunch of these of different lengths if you are getting started out in woodworking. Very handy tool, especially when working alone and you don't have somebody else to hold things in place while you need to drill. So again, you probably don't need big ones, 3 or 4 foot, which I have for building larger pieces. These little 12-inch ones are going to be fine. For working on a flat surface, I'm going to make sure this is all lined up. I'm just going to line the shelf up on top of the back piece, make sure those are lined up flush end to end, and tighten a clamp on both ends of this. So one there, flip around and do the other side. And this is where you can check if you messed up and the two pieces aren't exactly the same length. You might want to shave a little bit off of them. Actually, looking at this one, it's maybe 1 millimeter too long or something, so I'm going to go off camera in a second to finish shaving a little bit of that off so they're exactly the same length. But showing you the setup for what we're going to do, the clamps are now holding this in place so I can drill in from the top to hold this piece onto that piece. It is kind of considered a badge of honor in woodworking to do fancy joinery and build something without any screws. I don't care, especially since the way I'm hanging this on the wall, the top shelf here isn't going to be visible, so you're not going to be able to see the screws anyway. So what I'm going to do is take my drill, pre-drill a hole for each screw that is half the thickness of the wood up from the edge. So remember, these pieces are 3/4 inch thick, so I'm going to measure up 3/8 of an inch. Pre-drill holes on a longer piece, only one every foot or something. Maybe here I'll do just one on each end and one in the middle, and then we'll talk about driving the screws in a little bit. But first I'm going to go, again, shave a little bit off this wood so they're actually the same length. Okay, so I have marked, I don't know how well you'll be able to see this, it's not showing up too well on camera, but about 1 inch in from each edge, and then 3/8 of an inch up from the bottom edge, because that's halfway up the thickness of the wood on the other side, and put a little dot where I'm going to drill each hole. So, drill the holes. You are going to want a drill bit that is a slightly smaller diameter than your screw. You don't want to make the, let's see if I can get this to focus, the hole too wide, or else the threads of the screw aren't going to have anything to bite onto, because you will have drilled away too much wood. How to use a drill, how to chuck a bit into the drill and everything, that's kind of a topic for a different video, so I'm sure there's plenty of those on YouTube. I don't have one of my own, but you should be able to go look one up if you're not sure how to do that. But again, idea is you want a drill bit that's slightly smaller diameter than your screw. And I'm just going to drill straight in where I have this hole. I'm not going to film all three. I'll just demonstrate that one. And the next thing I'm going to do, since this is very close to the edge of the wood, there's a pretty big risk of splitting the wood if I just drill the screw in right there. Because if you look at the top of the screw, it's got this kind of tapered cone-shaped part. So that's going to drive a bigger wedge in when I crank this all the way, and that's going to risk splitting the wood, especially because I'm so close to the edge. So I'm going to use something called a countersink bit, which has this cone-shaped profile that kind of lets you drill out a wedge for the top of the screw so it can sit flush with the surface of the wood. So again, how to swap drill bits and everything, not going to cover that in this video. This one you have to be a little careful because I don't want to push too hard and make this hole too deep. I'm just very gently going to kind of eyeball it, again, especially since the top of this isn't going to be visible. See if I need to go a little deeper to make enough room for the head of this screw. Now I'm going to go back to my regular drill bit. And then I'm going to need to go find somewhere. This is actually not a Phillips head screw. It's a weird star bit, so I'm going to have to pause filming to go find the right drill bit for that. Okay, now I've got the right bit for this screw. I'm going to keep my drill on a pretty low setting because, again, I don't want to overpower this and split the wood. And just kind of carefully drill that in. And again, don't over tighten it because you're so close to the edge you don't want to split the wood. So I did that for one screw. I'm not going to film it, but I'm going to do it for the other two. Again, this piece is pretty short, so I'm only going to have 3 screws total. For something longer, you maybe want to screw once every foot or so. Anything less than that is probably overkill. So here we go with all 3 screws, and if this is all you want, just kind of something to screw the hooks onto on the shelf, then you're done. But we are going to keep going and show you how to do those end pieces. So thankfully the thicknesses work out, so you can just take your 1x4, put it like this, and now we can just mark where we're going to need to cut. So I am going to mark the bottom here. I'm going to mark that corner and mark this top edge right there, and then I'm going to want to draw a diagonal line from this corner to that edge. So I'm just going to take a ruler, carefully draw this, and now you can see how when I cut along this line and that line, I'm going to get an end cap piece that lines up with the front and the back, and then do the same thing on the other side. So I'm going to go off camera. I'm not going to show you the cutting because, again, I have a miter saw. You might have a different type of saw to do this with. But cut 2 of those pieces, and then we're going to screw them onto the ends. Okay, here are those 2 kind of trapezoid-shaped end cap pieces, and you see how they are going to fit nicely on the ends. And by virtue of cutting those and cutting out this triangle, I do get something that I could use as a divider if I wanted to. Now note how that is a little smaller. There's kind of a tiny gap on each end. So if you don't like that and you want it to go exactly from edge to edge, then you would need to have a little more wood and measure the height and depth here and cut a slightly bigger triangle. Since this one is so small, I'm not going to put a divider on it. I'm just going to have the 2 end caps, but again, if you want the dividers for different sections for different people or something, that's how you would do that. So to attach these, again, double check before you screw them in. If maybe it's easier to cut bigger and shave more wood off later. You can't really make them bigger after you cut them too small. So check that the edges line up all nice and flush, and go either shave off a little more with the saw, or you can even get some rough coarse grit sandpaper and shave them down. Now, attaching these can be a little harder depending on the length of your bookshelf and the size clamps you have. You can see my 12-inch clamps are not long enough to go across this whole thing. I have some bigger clamps that I'm going to go grab in a second, but for the one I built inside that was almost 8 feet long, I did not have clamps that were big enough, and I didn't have anybody helping me, so I had to very carefully hold this in place as I lined up and drilled the holes. But I'm going to go grab my 2-foot clamps and clamp these in place. Okay, I've got my clamps on there, and now this is a little tricky because I want to hold these perfectly still, And eventually I'm going to want to put 3 screws, one in each corner of this end piece, but my clamps are kind of blocking where I want 2 of those screws to go right now. So I'm going to put one up here first and then remove 1 clamp at a time. You also have to be careful with, I probably should have mentioned this earlier, the length of the screw you put in up here, because you don't want to drill in and hit this one. So maybe I probably should have put these in a little farther, or you can use a shorter screw to go in from the side here, because again, you don't want to hit that screw if you put it too close to the end. But again, same process as before. I could measure this, but I am going to be lazy and just kind of eyeball the center there. Going to be extremely careful when drilling because I am very close to the corner of this piece of wood. And when I built the big one, I did mess up and crack one of these. So go find the other drill bit. Okay, I'm just going to demonstrate one of these, not all 6 of them. Going to carefully drill here. Again, going to use my countersink bit because I really do not want to risk cracking this piece of wood since I'm drilling so close to the corner. See, even there with the countersink bit, I kind of started to chip off a little bit of that, so I'm going to need to be super careful when I screw that in. I'm actually going to pause and grab some shorter screws for a second. Okay, so here is my shorter screw. I'm going to very carefully screw this in from the side. Being super careful not to over tighten. Okay, now I'm actually going to take this off for a second. So I talked about, caring whether screws are visible or not. This doesn't look great from the side, especially with that little chip there that I kind of messed up. But something you can do is go to a hardware store and just get these little wood buttons that you can use to cover up screw holes. So these kind of have this mushroom shape, so they're designed to plug a recessed hole. I think you can buy them ones that are just the cap if you just want to put them on top of something, or do what I did. I just used a small saw and kind of cut off the bottom of these because I already had these in my garage and I didn't want to have to buy more. But then once the screws are in, you just use some wood glue and glue these over the hole so the screw is not visible from the side. So I'm not going to do that yet here. I just wanted to mention it as a finishing step. First, I'm going to go put the other 5 screws in. Again, I'm going to remove one. Actually, maybe I'll go do this one on the other side, and then I'll remove 1 clamp at a time, so there's 3 screws on each side. So there you go. Here is the completed frame. We're going to have 3 screws per side, and I wasn't worried about getting the countersink distance perfect on these because eventually I'm going to cover these up with those little buttons. Now, in terms of the actual hooks, this depends on the spacing you want for the hooks and whether you want those dividers. It looks like this would be good for maybe 3, one in the middle and then one kind of offset on each side. So again, this is no right or wrong way to do this. It's going to depend on the spacing you want. I would recommend, actually, let's back up for a second, putting the hooks on last. So finish this first if you're going to paint it or stain it or just leave it plain or anything like that. You saw the one inside. I actually just used brown spray paint on that I had left over from a different project, and then put a layer of clear polyurethane on top of it to help protect the paint. Again, finishing wood is kind of a much deeper topic for another video. I'm not going to cover that here. So this is just showing you how to build it. But point being, if you are then going to finish it in any way, I would do that before you put the hooks on. Otherwise, you're going to be painting or applying stain around the hooks, and that's going to be a huge pain. So again, pretend it's finished. But for now, you would then measure whatever you decide you want the offset for your hooks to be. If they're a little too far apart, it looks kind of weird. Let's see if I can grab another one here. Maybe I'm out of them and going to need to order more. So I'll use my broken one at the moment. But you can kind of envision what it would look like if I had a third one here. This kind of looks like if I had one more over there, spacing for 3 would be good. 4 is going to be a little too close together and be hard to kind of get hooks on and off of the adjacent pieces. So Once it's finished, again, these should come with screws. You would measure, line them up. Again, pre-drill pilot holes. These screws were pretty tiny, but it's always better to pre-drill so you don't split the wood. Screw these into place, and then you are ready to go mount it on the wall. So let's go back inside and talk about that. So, a very helpful tool when mounting stuff on a wall is a stud finder, and there are different versions of these things, but basic idea is they tell you where the wooden studs are behind your drywall. So this one is kind of an edge finder, so I turn it on and it doesn't show anything, and then as I scan along, it's going to show when it first detects the transition to an edge of a piece of wood. And you see I've marked this one before with pencil here. And then when I get past, well, I need to start off the wood. So there we go. It'll light up, detect the edge, and then when I get past it, it turns off. So you can mark the two edges of the stud, and then you want to drill a hole right in the center of that. So this hole here is actually from the previous store-bought coat racks, and then I decided to hang this one a little higher. So what you can do, and this part is much easier if you have a second person, kind of painted yourself, is just have somebody hold this in place and get a level. I don't have a level because, again, it's hard for me to do all of this and film everything. Hold a level on the top, mark the studs, mark where you need to drill the holes, pre-drill the holes, and then screw this into the wall. And this is where you are definitely going to want longer screws, like 3-inch or something, so it goes all the way through this 3/4 inch, all the way through your drywall, which is, I think, a 1/2 or 3/4 inch, and then has some good bite into the stud behind it, because those are going to be the load-bearing screws. So again, you don't want to only be a 1/2 inch or so into the stud, because then if, again, you have, like me, and you have kids, and one of them decides to climb on this thing, they're going to rip it off the wall. So if you are working alone and don't have help, one way to do this is to drill a pilot hole into the wall, line up and pre-drill the hole into the bookshelf, and then start to drive the screw, into the coat rack, not the bookshelf, and then line those up. You should be able to kind of sort of start to slide the screw into the drywall and just drive in that one screw. Don't hang anything heavy on it yet, because all the weight is going to be on that one screw, but that will then allow you to rotate it to get it level, and then drive in a second screw. So again, easier, especially for a big one like this, if you have somebody to help you hold it in place and hold it level as you put the screws in, but it is doable if you are working alone. Alright, that's it, and you can see here what this thing starts to look like when it gets loaded up with coats and book bags and hats and gloves and everything. So I am certainly glad we have it, although it seems like there's never enough space with all of the clothing my kids accumulate. So again, if you have a comment or a suggestion, or think I did something stupid or wrong or left something out of this video, go ahead and leave a comment below this one, and check out the rest of my channel for some other simple DIY woodworking projects for people who don't have a lot of fancy tools. Thank you.